The most notable geographic feature of the city of Longmont is the St. Vrain Creek and the valley formed by it that runs through the middle of town. It was along this small river that the first attempts to found a town in this region took place, taking the shape of a spread-out community called Burlington. However, these settlers found that the small creek, a vital source of water for farming, could become, during heavy rains or the spring thaw, a wide flooded river. When a more organized group arrived, the Chicago, Colorado colony in 1871, they decided to found the town of Longmont at the top of a ridge above the river to avoid this flooding. In the early 90s, the first major trail along the St. Vrain opened, now called the St. Vrain Greenway Trail. It runs for about 8 miles through town along the creek. Today I'd like to take you on a bike tour of the St. Vrain Greenway to experience the beauty of the trail, but also to stop along the way at a few sites from the history of Longmont to help us understand why the St. Vrain has been both the reason for the existence of the city, as well as one of its greatest challenges. We're starting at the eastern end of the Greenway Trail in an area called Sandstone Ranch. Today it houses parks and recreation facilities, as well as some historical buildings used for learning and community events. In the early 1860s, this area was the site of one of the first farms in the region, settled by Morse Coffin and his brothers. They were among early settlers who initially tried to pan for gold in the St. Vrain, but when that didn't work out, they shifted their focus to agriculture. Other settlers followed, spreading widely through the area, but always staying close to water like the St. Vrain and Boulder Creeks. It was not until Longmont was founded in 1871 that organized attempts were made to build irrigation systems. There's very little rain in the region, and so creeks like the St. Vrain were essential to allow any effective farming. If we look around, we can see the landscape above the creek, similar to what Stephen Long might have seen when he christened the region the Great American Desert in the early 1800s. Without water, it is dry and empty. But when we descend down into the valley, we'll see a very different landscape and get an idea of why the region was attractive to settlers from the east and how they transformed the region through the building of Longmont. Directly behind me, hidden in the trees and bushes, is the St. Vrain Creek. Further back, you can see the towers of the Great Western Sugar Factory. In the early 1900s, about 3 decades after the town of Longmont began in earnest, Frank M. Downer took the lead in negotiations to begin the construction of a sugar factory in Longmont. Other local communities had already jumped into the industry and demonstrated that land in the area was ideal for growing sugar beets. Negotiations were complicated, but with funding from the Havermeyer Sugar Trust and some willing Longmont farmers, the Great Western Sugar Factory was constructed and production began in late 1903. Soon, it was the dominant factory and business in Longmont, and its production continued for many years. Raising sugar beets was intense work, and immigrants from regions as diverse as Japan, Russia, and Scandinavia joined the community to work in the beet fields or the factory. However, as with other communities in the area, none of this would have been possible without water. Before the Chicago, Colorado colony arrived to found the town of Longmont in 1871, the farmers of the region were organized into a loose community called Burlington, stretched over a wide area in the St. Vrain River Valley. Near where I stand was an important ford across the creek, so a stagecoach stop was constructed here. It would be quite some time before any bridges would be constructed over this stretch of the St. Vrain, but a wide, shallow spot that could be crossed even during the spring growth of the river was an important location. However, as residents of Burlington discovered, living near the river presented some significant difficulties. Water for crops was necessary and valuable, but spring flooding could see the St. Vrain spread out over huge distances across the wide, flat valley. Without organization and funding to construct irrigation systems, their options were limited. So residents of Burlington were forced to live with the problem. When Longmont was founded, they chose to locate the town above the river to avoid the seasonal flooding, and many residents of Burlington relocated. This was only possible through a concerted effort by the new town to construct irrigation systems throughout the area to support farms further away from the river. But for decades, Longmont residents continued to build well above the river to avoid potential floods. Eric Mason's book, Longmont, The First 150 Years, notes significant flood events recorded in 1864, 1894, 1921, 1935, and 1969. The last of these was greatly mitigated by new dam and reservoir systems that spared the town from much damage. With the river seemingly well controlled, flooding didn't seem like as big a threat as it did back in the 1870s. Today, much of the city sits in the valley, which proved catastrophic when river control measures proved inadequate to the massive rains of September 2013. Let's move on, and after a brief detour, we'll see a portion of the trail where reconstruction from the flood is still ongoing 9 years later. Longmont residents were shocked at the level of flooding that swept through the region in late summer of 2013. That September saw intense amounts of rain that overwhelmed recently improved flood control measures, and by the morning of Thursday the 12th, the city was in a state of emergency. Low-lying areas along the river were evacuated as roads were flooded and bridges were compromised and closed, cutting the city in two. Some individuals were trapped or had vehicles swept away. Businesses, a mobile home park, and homes were flooded, as much of lower Longmont turned into a wide floodplain. Without a significant flooding threat since the late 1960s, the intensity of the event was shocking, and damages quickly stretched into the hundreds of millions of dollars. As rebuilding eventually began, city infrastructure and housing were top priorities, while recreational sites like the Vrain Greenway Trail ended up fairly far down the list. However, at this point, most damaged portions of the trail have been rebuilt and improved, with the river's path widened and cleared of dead trees. This portion representing one of the final sections to be addressed. The 2013 flood shows that even with significant measures in place, the St. Vrain remains a potential danger to the town. Drought conditions are common in this part of Colorado, one factor in the increasing outbreak of wildfires, and flooding does not often seem like a major consideration. Most of the time, the St. Vrain offers enjoyment and the water the town needs to thrive in a desert region. But there are those other moments sprinkled throughout the history of the town that show the potential danger that comes from the water. It's a difficult balance, and perhaps 2013 will be the last major flood the town will see, but that's a difficult prediction to make. The St. Vrain Greenway Trail ends right here in western Longmont at Golden Pond's natural area. Formerly the site of industrial mining pits, the area was donated to the city and gradually transformed into a series of ponds. Today it's a popular place for fishing, bird watching, and walking, not unlike other ponds and reservoirs in the region. Like the rest of the Greenway Trail, the area was flooded and damaged in the 2013 flood, but much of that has been repaired. In considering the problems of water in Longmont, whether flood or drought, it's also worth considering how effective water management has made sites like this available. filled with trees and foliage and wildlife. When settlers first began building in the region, in the days of Burlington and then the Chicago colony, there were few trees except along the river, and the region was fairly barren. While it is still a desert and gets little rain, for the past 4 decades the town has been designated an urban forest due to the abundance of trees planted and maintained by the city. Looking back to where we began our ride above Sandstone Ranch, the difference in the landscape seems clear. Despite the challenges and the dangers it has presented, the St. Vrain has been a vital resource in turning a desert region into a thriving city filled with trees, ponds, trails, and life. It's easy to drive past the creek and not give a second thought to it, but it's worth spending some time considering how far Longmont has come, and how the St. Vrain Creek is still a vital part of its existence. Thank you.